In the late 1800s, deep in the rural heart of Kansas, a family gathered in front of their weathered barn for what should have been a simple photograph, a memory frozen in time. But when the image was developed, something was wrong. Behind the smiling faces, in the darkness of the barn door, a figure stood that no one remembered seeing that day. A child's outline, faded but unmistakable, and the Harrow family swore that their only son had died years before. Locals would later call it the forgotten son. A photograph so ordinary at first glance, yet so deeply unsettling that it was locked away for decades. Because the longer you stare at it, the more your eyes begin to adjust. The grain, the light, the shadow, and then you realize he's looking back at you. Tonight, we reopen that photograph. The story behind it is not just about one family's tragedy, but about a haunting that refused to be forgotten. In the summer of 1889, deep within the amber fields of rural Kentucky, the Thompson family gathered for a photograph that was meant to mark a new beginning. Their farmhouse had survived 2 floods, 1 fire, and the slow decay of the land that seemed to curse every neighbor who settled nearby. Yet, on that warm July afternoon, the family wore their best clothes and stood proudly beside the barn their father had built by hand. The photographer, a traveling man named Elias Gray, arrived by horse cart, his old wooden camera gleaming beneath the sunlight. He was known for capturing not just likenesses, but souls, or so people whispered. He arranged the Thompsons just as he had dozens of families before them. The father with his hands resting firmly on the shoulders of his eldest boy, the mother seated in her faded lace gown, the 2 daughters pressed close together. But there was something uneasy about the youngest child, Daniel. He was not among them. When Elias asked, the mother hesitated, then murmured something about the boy being unwell. Still, the family smiled when the shutter clicked, freezing that single moment of rural stillness and time. Days later, when Elias developed the plate in the dim light of his portable tent, he saw something impossible. Between the father and the barn door, where there had been nothing but shadow, a small figure stood half-hidden, a boy's outline, too solid to be a trick of exposure, too distinct to be chance. His eyes seemed wide, not with joy, but with knowing. At first, Elias thought it was a mistake, a double exposure, maybe a smudge on the glass. But when he tilted the photo toward the light, the boy's face emerged clearer. Pale, sunken cheeks, lips pressed tight, eyes that didn't belong to the living. Elias knew better than to tamper with such things. He packed up his chemicals, buried the ruined plate beneath the dirt behind the barn, and left before sunrise. The Thompsons never saw that first photograph. Instead, he took another one, a safer one, but he could never forget that image of the boy standing in the doorway, staring straight at him. Weeks later, news spread through the valley that little Daniel Thompson had passed away in his sleep. His mother said he'd been whispering about the barn the night before, something about the boy inside. The family held a small funeral on their land, burying him beneath the cottonwood tree that overlooked the fields. No one mentioned the first photograph. Elias never returned. But years later, when the barn was sold after the family's mysterious disappearance, the new owners discovered a buried box behind the west wall. Inside were broken glass plates, one still intact enough to show what Elias had seen. That photo, now kept in a private collection in Missouri, became known among collectors as the Forgotten Son. Some say the figure in the doorway changes when the light shifts, as if the child moves closer each time the photograph is viewed. Others claim you can still see faint handprints pressed into the wood near the barn door if you visit the old Thompson property. No one's lived there in decades, yet neighbors still report lights flickering in the windows long after midnight. When the photograph resurfaced, it wasn't in the hands of the Thompsons, but rather a wandering antiques dealer named Samuel Keene. In 1923, he stumbled upon the collapsed barn while scouting abandoned properties for salvageable goods. The land had long been left to rot. Fences crumbled, windows shattered, the roof sagged like a tired spine. Inside, Samuel found traces of a once busy family life. A broken lantern, children's shoes turned to leather husks, a rocking chair missing a leg. But it was in the farthest, darkest corner of the barn, beneath a mound of hay stiff with age, that he discovered a small wooden box, sealed shut with wire and coated in a strange layer of tar. Someone, it seemed, had wanted it hidden forever. When he pried it open, a stale scent escaped, part mildew, part something sweet and wrong, like dried flowers rotting in water. Inside lay a glass plate negative, its surface smudged and clouded, but the faint outline of figures was visible: a man, a woman, two girls. Between them, a blurred streak, perhaps a child, though Samuel couldn't be sure. He took the plate to a nearby photo shop, hoping to restore it. The shop owner, an old man with thick spectacles, held it up to the light and froze. Behind the Post family, in the doorway of the barn, stood the unmistakable outline of a boy. His eyes, dark and hollow, were fixed directly on the lens. The old man set the plate down, muttered a prayer, and refused to touch it again. Samuel didn't heed the warning. He kept the photograph, fascinated and disturbed by the impossible detail in the boy's face. Over the following weeks, he began showing it to townsfolk, swearing the boy's expression shifted each time he looked, sometimes sorrowful, sometimes smiling faintly, as if aware of being seen. Within months, his friends noticed changes in him too. His letters grew paranoid, filled with rambling notes about footsteps outside his door and the sound of a child's voice whispering his name. He wrote of muddy footprints appearing near his bed, always small, always leading toward the window. His final journal entry, dated December 17, 1924, read simply, "He's closer now. He wants to come home." Days later, Samuel was found dead, his hands tightly clutching shards of the shattered glass plate. The coroner said heart failure, but neighbors whispered that he'd tried to destroy the photograph, and the boy hadn't let him. Local papers ran the story briefly before dismissing it as hysteria. But to this day, those who visit the Thompson property claim the air feels heavier near the barn, and the old doorway seems to flicker when photographed, as though one extra face still lingers in the shadows. By 1931, the story of the Thompson barn boy had spread through rural Kansas like wildfire. Farmers whispered about the cursed photograph passed between collectors, each one claiming to hear faint knocks or feel cold drafts when viewing it after dark. It was around that time that Eleanor Briggs, a young reporter from the Wichita Herald, decided to investigate. She was known for chasing odd tales, phantom trains, haunted churches, things that straddled the line between truth and madness. The Thompson case, though, fascinated her more than any other. A dead boy captured in a photo, his presence defying explanation. It was the perfect storm of mystery and dread. Eleanor took a train west to the deserted township of Eddington, where the Thompson family had once lived. When she arrived, she found a place nearly swallowed by time. The wind carried dust through empty streets, and the skeletal remains of barns leaned at crooked angles like they were bowing to the earth. She located an old woman named Agnes Crowley, one of the last people who remembered the Thompsons. Her memory came in pieces, a family of 5, friendly but reclusive, who kept mostly to themselves. "They lost a boy, didn't they?" Eleanor asked. Agnes nodded slowly. "Lost or hid?" She replied, eyes fixed on the dying light outside the window. "They said he wasn't right. Wouldn't speak. Wouldn't sleep. Always watching." Agnes claimed that after the boy's disappearance, strange things began happening around the farm. Animals went missing, tools moved on their own, and neighbors said they saw a lantern light in the barn long after the Thompsons had left. Eleanor pressed for more details, but Agnes grew quiet, clutching a wooden rosary that had nearly splintered from use. "They tried to take a family photo before he vanished," she whispered. "Said they wanted to remember better days. But when the plate came back from the photographer, that boy was there twice." Eleanor frowned. "Twice. Once standing with them," Agnes said, "and once behind them. Same eyes, same face, different smiles." That night, Eleanor rented a room in the only boarding house still open in Eddington. The walls were thin, the floorboards uneven, and the wind outside moaned like something alive. She placed her typewriter by the window, the half-moon casting a pale reflection across the keys. As she began writing her notes, a low creak echoed from the hallway. Then, faintly, she heard a child's laugh, distant, playful, and impossibly familiar. She rushed to the door, opening it into darkness. Nothing was there, except a trail of small, muddy prints leading toward the stairs. Eleanor didn't sleep that night, and by morning, she had only one thought in her mind. She had to find the original photograph. 2 days later, Eleanor's search led her to the St. Mary's Church archives, an old stone building just outside the town's limits. The church had once served as both a sanctuary and a record keeper for rural families, and its cellar was rumored to hold artifacts dating back to the 1800s. Dust coated every inch of the basement, and the air felt unnaturally still, as if the building itself was holding its breath. With the help of Father Jonathan, a weary priest with trembling hands, she combed through boxes of deteriorating glass negatives and faded ledgers. Most were ordinary: births, marriages, family portraits of smiling faces long since gone, until she found one wrapped in cloth and sealed with melted wax. It bore a faded label, "Thompson Family, 1889. Her pulse quickened. When she held the fragile plate up to the light, her eyes widened. There they were, 5 figures arranged stiffly in front of the old barn. The father, tall and solemn. The mother, her expression tight. 3 children, 2 standing, 1 seated on a stool. But then, behind them, barely visible in the shadows of the barn's doorway, a 6th shape. A boy. His outline was faint, his face blurred, but his eyes shone like pale marbles caught in the flash. Eleanor's hands shook as she studied it. "Do you see that?" she asked the priest. Father Jonathan hesitated before nodding slowly. "It's a trick of exposure," he muttered, but his voice betrayed unease. That evening, Eleanor requested permission to make a photographic copy. The priest reluctantly agreed, though he warned her that some memories aren't meant to be woken. She set up her portable developing kit in the rectory's spare room and began the careful process of transferring the image. The air smelled of chemicals and damp wood. As the faint outline of the Thompsons began to emerge in the solution, the lamp flickered. For a brief second, she thought she saw the boy's head turn, not in the image itself, but in the reflection on the glass tray. She froze. Her heart pounded in her chest as a cold draft swept through the room, extinguishing the flame entirely. When she relit the lamp, the photograph was different. The figures looked subtly altered. The father's eyes now turned toward the boy in the doorway, and the shadow on the barn wall had stretched higher, almost touching the rafters. Eleanor stared, unsure if it was exhaustion, light distortion, or something else. Then came the faint sound again, that same childlike giggle, drifting from the hallway. Only this time, she could swear she heard footsteps moving closer. The priest found her minutes later, still trembling, clutching the photograph to her chest. "It's him," she whispered. "He's still here." The next morning, Eleanor returned to the county hall, her mind still replaying the night's events. She couldn't shake the image of the 6th figure, that faint boy lurking in the shadows of the barn. Determined to find answers, she began combing through census data, family registries, and land records from the late 1800s. The Thompson family name appeared often, a typical farming lineage, but when she reached the 1889 entry, something felt off. According to the official census, only 5 members of the household existed: Charles, Margaret, and their 3 children, Henry, Ruth, and little Samuel. No mention of another boy. Eleanor frowned. She compared the photo once more to the census notes. The ages matched the faces she could identify, but the shadowed child, the one standing behind them, was a complete mystery. She checked birth records, then church documents. Nothing. It was as though the 6th figure had been erased from history entirely. But there was one small clue, a faint, handwritten annotation at the bottom of an old baptism record. Infant male, name withheld, died before christening. The date matched the spring of 1889, only weeks before the family's portrait was taken. A cold realization crept over Eleanor as she whispered aloud. They took the photograph after he was already gone. Her discovery unsettled her deeply. In the late 19th century, post-mortem photography had been common, particularly in rural America, where families saw it as their only chance to capture a loved one's likeness before burial. But this was different. The boy in the picture wasn't posed like a corpse. He was standing, his hands visible, his gaze fixed straight toward the camera. Eleanor's pulse raced as she studied the angle of light, the positioning of his shadow. Everything suggested he had moved during the exposure. She shared her findings with Father Jonathan later that day, laying out the evidence before him. "It's not possible," he muttered, yet his eyes avoided the photograph. Perhaps they wanted to believe he was still with them. Eleanor shook her head. "No," she said softly, "he was with them." The priest's expression hardened, fear replacing doubt. That night, unable to sleep, Eleanor set the photograph beside her bed. When she woke before dawn, it had shifted, not fallen, not slid, but moved, perfectly upright, facing her. And for the first time, she swore the faintest trace of a small, pale handprint marked the edge of the frame. The following evening, Eleanor drove out to the outskirts of town, where the Thompson farm once stood. The road narrowed into a single dirt trail framed by skeletal trees, their branches clawing at the fog. She parked near a rusted fence, the remnants of what had once been a thriving pasture. Only fragments of the barn remained, a sagging roof, half swallowed by vines, and a door that creaked open as if expecting her. She stepped inside with her lantern raised, its dim circle of light sweeping across rotting beams and dust that hung heavy like smoke. The air was unnaturally still. No insects, no wind, only the faint hum of the lantern flame. Then, faintly, she noticed it. Footprints. Small ones, pressed deep into the dirt, leading toward the back wall where an old ladder leaned against a beam. She followed the prints, her heart tightening with every step. The scent of damp hay and old wood mixed with something sour, decay, perhaps, or time itself. When she reached the ladder, she paused. The top led to a narrow loft space, dark as a well. She raised the lantern, and for a brief moment, something reflected back, two small glints, like eyes. She froze. Her breath caught, and the light trembled in her hand. It wasn't possible. No one had lived here for decades. She whispered into the silence, "Who's there?" The only response was the low creak of the rafters above her, and the faint sound of breathing that did not belong to her. Eleanor steadied herself and climbed the ladder slowly, every step echoing like a heartbeat. The loft smelled of old straw and dust, thick enough to choke her. When her head cleared the top, she saw a row of objects laid neatly across a beam, children's toys. Wooden blocks, a doll missing one eye, a small wooden horse carved crudely but lovingly. She set the lantern down beside them, noticing that each toy was coated with a fine layer of soot, except one. The horse gleamed faintly, as though someone had touched it recently. She lifted it in her hand, and a whisper seemed to float through the air, "He never left." Startled, Eleanor dropped the toy, and it fell, splintering against the floor below. The whisper stopped. Then came a sound so faint it barely seemed real, a single footstep on the barn floor. She glanced down and saw it, a shadow moving across the dirt, small, childlike, gliding toward the light of her lantern. The flame flickered once, twice, then died, plunging her into total darkness. And in that void, she heard a boy's voice, quiet, trembling, yet close enough to feel his breath. "You finally found me." Eleanor gasped and stumbled backward, her foot slipping on the straw-covered loft floor. The boy's voice echoed in her mind, thin and sorrowful, not quite a whisper, not quite a sound. She fumbled for her matches and relit the lantern, its flickering glow pushing the darkness back just far enough for her to see a small figure crouched in the corner. A child, pale, still, eyes fixed on her with a sorrow that pierced through time itself. His clothes were tattered, his face streaked with dirt, but what struck her most was the familiarity. It was the same face from the photograph. The same round cheeks, the same haunting stare. She whispered, barely breathing, "Daniel." The name felt like a memory that wasn't hers. The boy didn't answer. He simply tilted his head, as if listening to something beyond the walls. The wind outside began to moan through the cracks, and with it came faint voices, children laughing, then crying, their tones bending between joy and anguish. Eleanor's pulse thundered in her ears. She moved closer, though every instinct screamed not to. The air grew colder, her breath visible. "What happened to you?" she asked softly. The boy's lips parted. "He said I had to stay. I didn't want to." His voice was faint, brittle as old glass. Eleanor shivered, sensing there was something deeper in his words, something trapped here long before her arrival. Eleanor kneeled beside him, her lantern light trembling across the beams above. That's when she saw it, a name carved into the wood. Daniel, followed by deep gouges, as if scratched in desperation. Beneath it, the faint outline of another word, hidden. Her chest tightened. "Hidden from what?" she asked. The boy's gaze drifted past her, toward the floorboards below. "He wanted me to be quiet," he murmured, "but I wasn't." The sound of the wind outside turned sharp, almost human, carrying a low groan through the barn's hollow frame. Eleanor's eyes followed Daniel's to the floor beneath them. Something was off about the wood, uneven, newer in places. As she lowered her lantern closer, she saw faint stains darkened into the grain. Blood, old but unmistakable. Her fingers trembled as she traced it. "Daniel, who made you stay here?" she whispered. The boy's expression twisted, pain flickering through his translucent face. His reply came so softly that she almost didn't hear it. "My father." The lantern sputtered again, and the entire barn seemed to sigh, as if releasing a breath it had held for over a century. Eleanor steadied herself as the wind outside roared through the open gaps in the barn walls, carrying with it a whistle that sounded eerily like a sigh. Her lantern flame quivered in the draft, throwing ghostly shadows that danced across the old beams. She turned her eyes back to the uneven floorboards, her mind replaying the boy's trembling confession, "My father." A cold weight settled in her stomach. With hesitant hands, she pried at the planks, each creak echoing like a scream in the stillness. The wood gave way with a groan, releasing a puff of stale air thick with the scent of decay. Beneath the loose boards was darkness, and then the unmistakable glint of metal. Eleanor leaned closer, brushing away the dirt. A small silver locket, dulled by age, caught the lantern's dim light. She opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a faded photograph, the same boy, Daniel, his expression solemn, his eyes unervingly lifelike. Opposite his image was another, a man, broad-faced, with an unsettling grin. "The father," she whispered. As she stared at the locket, the barn seemed to close in around her, the air thick with something unspoken. A sound came from below, a faint tapping, rhythmic and deliberate. Eleanor froze. The boy in the corner was gone. The tapping grew louder, like fingers drumming impatiently on wood. Then came the voice, raspy and low. "You shouldn't have opened it." Eleanor's lantern flickered violently, plunging the barn into quick bursts of light and shadow. She turned toward the sound, her breath shallow. The floor beneath her seemed to pulse, as though something alive shifted underneath. Heart pounding, she grabbed the crowbar resting by the stall and wedged it between the boards. With a sharp pull, she tore another plank free, and her light fell upon a small, skeletal hand, curled around the dirt as if clawing its way out. The tapping had stopped. The truth sank in like a knife. Daniel hadn't simply disappeared. He had been buried here, beneath his family's own barn. The father's grin from the locket flashed in her mind. Rage, guilt, madness, whatever it was, it had driven him to bury his own child and photograph the family as though nothing had happened. Eleanor's throat tightened as realization washed over her. The extra figure in the photograph, the shadowed boy standing in the doorway, had been Daniel's spirit, trapped where he'd died. A chill crept up her spine as she looked back to where the boy had stood moments ago. The space was empty, save for the faint shimmer of dust, twisting in the cold air like a departing breath. Eleanor stumbled backward, her lantern nearly slipping from her grasp. The skeletal hand beneath the floorboards was so small, so human, that her mind refused to accept it. For a long, dreadful moment, she could only stare. Then, Slowly, she reached for the locket again, her fingers trembling, and lifted it toward the light. Daniel's image seemed clearer now, sharper than before, his pale face almost illuminated from within. The man beside him, the father, appeared darker, his grin more strained, the edges of his eyes seeming to warp in the weak light. The photograph within the locket was changing. Her breath came shallow and fast. "No," she whispered. She blinked and looked again, but the father's face had vanished entirely. Only the boy remained, his eyes locked onto hers, hollow and pleading. A faint sob escaped Eleanor's throat. She turned toward the camera on the table, an old box camera the family had used for that final portrait, the one that had revealed the sixth figure. Something about the camera felt wrong. Its lens, cracked and dust-covered, reflected the lantern's glow like a single staring eye. Eleanor lifted it carefully. As her thumb brushed the shutter, the metal was warm. Too warm. Her hand recoiled instinctively, but it was already too late. The flash went off in a burst of blinding white light. When her vision cleared, she wasn't in the same place anymore. The barn looked different. The walls were cleaner, straighter, newer. The smell of rot was gone, replaced by the dry scent of hay and oil lamps. Voices murmured somewhere outside. Eleanor's pulse quickened. She stepped toward the barn door and peered through the crack. The world beyond was bathed in daylight, not the pale gray of morning, but the heavy amber of a summer afternoon. A horse neighed in the distance. Men's laughter drifted in from the fields. She wasn't in her own time anymore. Her gaze fell on the open barn floor, and her heart seized. A man knelt beside the hole, shovel in hand. The same broad face, the same grin from the locket. His sleeves were rolled to the elbows, his arms slick with sweat and dirt. And lying beside him on the floor was a boy, limp and silent. "Daniel." The man whispered something under his breath, almost like a prayer, before covering the child's body with earth. Each shovel of soil landed with a dull, sickening thud. Eleanor wanted to scream, but her voice caught in her chest. Then, as if sensing her unseen presence, the man stopped. He lifted his head and looked directly toward her, not through her, but at her. His lips curled into a slow, knowing smile. Eleanor stumbled back from the crack in the barn wall, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. The air shimmered, a ripple of heat, or maybe time itself, bending around her. She tried to blink, to wake up, but the world refused to shift. The man in the field was still there, the dirt-stained shovel resting on the small mound he had created. Then, ever so slowly, he began walking toward the barn. His movements were deliberate, calm, like a man strolling toward something he'd been expecting for years. Eleanor turned to flee, but her lantern was gone. The barn seemed darker now, heavier, as if the shadows themselves had thickened. The man's footsteps echoed, soft at first, then louder, crunching against the hay-strewn floor. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice deep and coarse, yet eerily familiar. "You shouldn't have touched it." She backed away until her spine pressed against the wooden wall. I didn't mean to," she stammered, clutching the locket against her chest. His gaze followed the glint of it, and a flicker of anger crossed his face. "You brought it back," he hissed. "After all this time." The air grew colder. He stepped closer, his boots leaving dark impressions in the dirt. Then Eleanor noticed something terrifying. The man's body cast no shadow. Eleanor's breath came in sharp, panicked gasps. The realization struck her like a jolt of electricity. The man wasn't alive, not anymore. The locket had pulled her into the memory of his sin, into the moment his soul was trapped between worlds. And now, it was looking for a way out. She turned to the camera still hanging from her neck. It felt heavier than before, as if something inside it was alive, watching her. The cracked lens gleamed with faint red light, pulsing like a heartbeat. She could hear a faint ticking from within, a slow, deliberate rhythm that didn't match the sound of her own pulse. Then, without touching it, the shutter clicked. A blinding white flash filled the barn. Eleanor covered her face, but she felt the warmth of something brushing past her, cold fingers grazing her arm, a whisper slipping through her hair. When the light faded, She found herself back in the present, the decayed barn restored to its abandoned ruin. But the camera was still in her hands. And when she looked through the lens, her reflection wasn't alone. Behind her, faint but visible, stood the man from 1889, smiling. Eleanor stumbled out of the barn, the camera clutched tight in her trembling hands. The dawn light was breaking over the fields, painting the horizon in muted gold, but it felt wrong, too still, like the world itself was holding its breath. She couldn't shake the image she'd seen through the lens. The man's smile, faint, knowing, patient, burned in her mind like an afterimage she couldn't blink away. She told herself it wasn't real, just exhaustion and fear. But the camera felt alive. She brought it home, intending to hand it over to the sheriff or the local historian. But that night, as she placed it on her kitchen table, the faint sound of the shutter clicking broke the silence. She froze. The camera had moved, ever so slightly, its lens now pointing toward the window. Then came another click. And another. Eleanor's body stiffened. She crept closer and saw that the camera had advanced its own film reel, though she hadn't loaded any. The glass on its cracked lens gleamed faintly in the moonlight, like an unblinking eye. Her pulse quickened as she realized the truth. It wasn't taking photos of her house. It was taking photos inside the house. Each click echoed like a heartbeat, and she knew it was seeing something she couldn't. She snatched the camera, shoving it into an old drawer and slamming it shut, but the sound didn't stop. From within the drawer came a slow, rhythmic clicking, like a ghost breathing in intervals of light. By morning, she convinced herself it had been a dream. But when she opened the drawer, a single undeveloped photo sat where the camera had been. Her hands shook as she held it to the window, letting the sun reveal its image. The photograph showed her kitchen, every detail perfect, except one. Standing behind her chair was the same man from 1889. His eyes, milky and sunken, stared directly at her. Panicking, Eleanor threw the photo into the fireplace. It curled, blackened, but the image didn't fade. Instead, faint whispers began filling the room, distant voices bleeding through the crackling flames. "You brought us back," they murmured. "You opened the shutter." The whispers grew into a low moan, spreading through the walls, the floorboards, even the air itself. Every mirror in the house began to fog from within, shapes forming behind the misted glass, faces, dim and sorrowful, pressing against the other side. And as she backed away in terror, her foot struck something solid. The camera was there again, lying on the floor, its lens pointed upward, waiting. The shutter clicked once more. For days after that night, Eleanor didn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the man from the photograph, standing just beyond her sight line, blurred like a memory that refused to fade. She covered the mirrors, nailed blankets over the windows, and locked the drawer where she thought the camera still rested. But the clicking sound, soft, deliberate, steady, kept returning from the walls. Sometimes it echoed from the attic. Sometimes from beneath the floorboards. When she finally gathered the courage to visit the sheriff, she carried the scorched remnants of the photograph in a tin box. Sheriff Harlan Green, a man who'd seen more than his share of tragedy, didn't take her seriously at first. But when he opened the box, his expression changed. The photo, though blackened by fire, still revealed a faint image. Eleanor's kitchen, the man's pale face, and now, Harlan's own figure, standing behind her. He dropped the box immediately, backing away. That afternoon, he sent 2 deputies to inspect her home. Neither returned. When he rode out to the farmhouse at dusk, all he found were their horses, reins tangled around the fence posts, their saddles smeared with dust and something darker. Inside, the air smelled of old chemicals and burnt wood. The walls were covered in fresh photographs, hundreds of them, each one nailed, hung, or scattered on the floor. Every photo showed the same scene, a group of people standing in front of the barn, smiling. But in each version, one more face appeared. In the last row of images, Eleanor stood front and center, her face pale, eyes hollow, her body frozen in a posture of quiet surrender. Behind her, Sheriff Green could be seen, just barely visible, his outline faint like a ghost caught mid-step. He realized then what the curse truly did. Each photograph wasn't just an image, it was a trap. Every person who looked at the cursed photo, who allowed themselves to be seen by the lens, became a part of the next image. Harlan tried to burn them all, but the fire wouldn't catch. The photos seemed damp, though they were dry to the touch. In frustration, he tore one in half, and a scream, muffled and distant, echoed through the barn. The torn image bled at the edges, a dark liquid soaking into the wooden boards beneath his feet. Panicked, he fled into the fields. But even as he ran, the sound followed him. The clicking of the camera, steady as a heartbeat, chasing him through the tall grass. He turned once, breath ragged, and saw the barn's windows flicker with light. A flash, blinding and white, erupted across the field. When the townsfolk came searching the next morning, they found the sheriff's badge lying near the barn door, half buried in soil. And nailed to the barn wall beside the others was a new photograph. In it, Harlan Green stood beside Eleanor, both smiling faintly, eyes glazed over. By the time the townsfolk realized something was terribly wrong at the old Harrow's farm, it was already too late. The photographs had begun to circulate, passed quietly between hands, shown in whispers, copied by traveling merchants who thought they'd stumbled on a strange relic. Each print looked slightly different, as though the image itself were alive, adjusting, waiting. In some versions, Eleanor was missing. In others, the man behind the family was more visible, his face sharper, his stare colder. But in every one, there was movement, a faint blur around the eyes, a sense that the figures were never quite still. At the general store, a boy named Samuel found one of the photos tucked between newspaper stacks. He brought it home, curious, and showed it to his mother before dinner. She smiled faintly, remarking how lifelike the people appeared. That night, Samuel woke to the sound of their front door creaking open. When his mother checked the next morning, his bed was empty. The photo, which had been left on the table, now showed 6 figures instead of 5. Samuel stood among them. Within a week, 3 more children vanished from the same road. The sheriff's office, now under new leadership, issued a public warning, urging anyone in possession of old photographs from the Harrow's estate to destroy them immediately. But the photos wouldn't burn. They wouldn't tear. And worse, each attempt seemed to create more copies. Town rumor said that even trying to forget the image was dangerous, that once you'd seen the 6th figure, it saw you too. Soon, the local church became the gathering point for frightened families. The preacher, Reverend Collier, insisted on a public burning, a ritual cleansing to drive out what he called the sin of false remembrance. On the evening of the burning, nearly everyone from the nearby farms gathered in the churchyard, clutching the cursed photos in trembling hands. As the fire roared, the preacher lifted one photograph toward the flames. For a moment, the light illuminated the image clearly, and someone in the crowd gasped. In that fleeting second, the people in the photo moved. Not like a trick of the eye, but truly moved. Heads turning, eyes blinking. The man behind the family stepped forward, pressing one pale hand against the inside of the image, as though reaching through it. The photograph curled, then burst into embers. The crowd screamed. When the smoke cleared, Reverend Collier was gone. Only his spectacles remained, lying beside the fire pit, their lenses cracked and glinting red. And then someone noticed, nailed to the church door, a new photo. It showed the same congregation gathered around the flames, but the preacher stood at the center, smiling faintly, his hand resting on Eleanor Harrow's shoulder. From that night onward, no one dared to take photographs in that part of Kansas again. Word of the Harrow photographs spread beyond the borders of Kansas, carried first by traveling merchants, then by journalists who smelled opportunity. By the spring of 1890, a writer named Charles Denning arrived from Chicago with a camera, a notebook, and a dangerous curiosity. He'd read snippets of the tale in rural papers, whispers of a living photograph, of eyes that followed those who stared too long. The locals tried to warn him, but Denning, hardened by years of reporting on murder trials and disasters, dismissed it all as superstition. He visited the abandoned Harrow farmhouse one gray afternoon. The structure still stood, though half collapsed, its barn leaning like a weary man. Inside, he found remnants of a life once lived: a child's shoe, a cracked mirror, a half-burned photograph nailed to the wall. The light filtering through the broken windows seemed thick, almost solid, like dust and memory had fused into the air. Denning took out his camera and began snapping pictures, muttering to himself about rural hysteria. When he developed the first plate that night in his rented boarding room, his hands began to tremble. The photo showed the interior exactly as he'd seen it, except for one thing. In the corner of the frame, behind the doorway, stood a man, blurred but distinct, with one hand on a small boy's shoulder. The same pose. The same man described by every villager who dared to look at the cursed image. Denning didn't sleep that night. By dawn, he was back on a train to Chicago, the photograph hidden deep in his coat pocket. In Chicago, Denning submitted his article to the Herald under the title "The Photograph That Refused to Die." It was printed 3 days later and became the talk of the city. People were fascinated, a story of death, madness, and proof of something beyond the grave. The Herald's circulation doubled overnight. But within a week, the editors grew uneasy. 2 printers had gone missing, and the darkroom technician who handled Denning's plates was found unconscious near the presses, muttering about a sixth figure that appeared in every test copy. When the police entered Denning's apartment, they found his desk overturned, the window wide open, curtains fluttering in the wind. His camera sat on the table, still loaded with undeveloped film. And in the corner, pinned to the wall with a single nail, was the same photograph from Kansas, now altered once again. The Harrow family remained in the center, but this time Denning himself stood behind them, half-faded, his face caught mid-turn, eyes wide with terror. The photograph was confiscated as evidence. Weeks later, it vanished from the police archives without explanation. Decades passed, and the Harrow story became one of those strange footnotes whispered in rural taverns and stitched into ghost anthologies. The farmhouse collapsed sometime around 1910, but the photograph didn't die with it. A Chicago collector of spirit photography, a man named Elijah Boone, reportedly bought it from a retired police officer who'd kept it hidden in a trunk for nearly 20 years. Boone's fascination was morbid but scholarly. He believed early photographers had accidentally captured transdimensional residue, traces of souls bleeding through the veil between life and death. In 1914, Boone displayed the Harrow photograph at a private séance attended by academics, skeptics, and the idle wealthy. He projected it onto a white sheet using a lantern slide. The guests, amused at first, soon fell silent, because as the lantern's light flickered, the faces in the image seemed to move. Subtle at first, the tilt of a head, the turn of an eye, but then unmistakable. Several guests claimed the little boy's mouth had parted, as if whispering a word. One woman fainted. Another swore she heard a child's laugh echo through the parlor, though there were no children in the house. Boone laughed it off publicly, calling it a trick of the flame and the brain's imagination. But privately, he wrote in his diary that something in the room had changed that night. The air had thickened, the light dimmed unnaturally. His final entry, dated a week later, was a single line written shakily across the page. They are not trapped in the photo is trapped in them. When Boone's body was found days later, the coroner ruled it a heart attack. His camera was still running, pointed toward the wall where the photograph hung. The film, when developed, showed nothing but that image. Yet in each successive frame, one more figure appeared behind Boone, standing closer and closer until only their eyes were visible in the final shot. The photograph vanished once again, reportedly taken by Boone's assistant, who swore he'd destroy it. But in 1932, the same photograph surfaced in a traveling carnival exhibit called Portraits of the Beyond. Patrons paid 5 cents to view it inside a red velvet tent. Some left laughing. Others stumbled out pale, muttering about seeing movement where there was none. The carnival burned to the ground weeks later, its owner found dead beside the ashes, clutching a singed scrap of paper, a fragment of the Harrow photograph, with the same unknown boy's face, perfectly intact. The fire was ruled accidental. But those who sifted through the remains said something strange. In the melted glass of the photo frames, human shapes were reflected, figures no one could account for. By the 1950s, the story of the Harrow photograph had become little more than a regional ghost tale, a bedtime warning whispered by grandparents who still lit kerosene lamps and locked barn doors at sundown. But one man brought it back to life. Dr. Samuel Wren, a historian working with the Kansas Historical Restoration Project. While cataloging forgotten family artifacts donated by local farms, he discovered an unmarked wooden box lined with brittle newspaper. Inside was a single photograph, its sepia tones still preserved beneath cracked glass. Across the bottom, barely visible, was a faint penciled note. Harrow Farm, 1889. Dr. Wren had never heard of the legend. To him, it was simply a remarkable example of early rural photography, and he arranged to have it cleaned and digitized for preservation. Yet the technician assigned to scan it refused to finish the job. She said that every time the scanner light passed over the image, the shadows changed, not like dust or glare, but like the movement of living people. Wren dismissed her concerns until he saw the digital copy himself. There, just behind the family, a faint outline had appeared, a shape resembling a child standing inside the barn doorway, where no one had been in the original. Wren assumed a trick of exposure, but when he attempted to print the digital version, the machine jammed. When he finally pried open the printer tray, he found the paper fused solid, and on its glossy surface, the shape was clearer. A boy's face, unsmiling, eyes too bright for the century that birthed him. Obsessed, Dr. Wren began searching archives for the Harrow name. He found a coroner's record dated 1889 listing Jonathan, Mary, and Peter Harrow among the dead after a barn collapse, though no such event had ever been officially reported. Stranger still, the report was unsigned, the ink abruptly cut off, as though the writer had been interrupted. That night, Wren brought the photograph home, intending to study it under better light. Neighbors later said they saw his house flicker with strange illumination, not candle or bulb, but something bluish, like lightning trapped indoors. When colleagues visited the next morning, the front door was ajar. Every bulb in the house had burst. The photograph sat on the dining table, untouched, but Wren was gone. Only his tape recorder remained, still running, filled with hours of faint static, and beneath it, a child's soft humming. Authorities dismissed it as a tragic disappearance. But in the archived audio, restoration experts later detected one final whisper just before the tape cut off. A child's voice, faint yet distinct. "Don't take my picture again." By the 1970s, America had developed a fascination with the paranormal. Ghost stories filled paperbacks, talk shows hosted self-proclaimed mediums, and late-night radio whispered about the supernatural from coast to coast. It was during this wave that the Harrow photograph resurfaced, now called The Boy in the Barn by those who traded copies of it through mail-order occult clubs. No one knew where the original was, though some believed it had been confiscated by Kansas authorities after Dr. Wren's disappearance. What circulated instead were low-quality prints, copies of copies, their edges warped and faces distorted from decades of duplication. In 1976, a local television station in Wichita planned a Halloween special titled Midnight Haunts of the Heartland. The show's producers included a short segment about cursed photographs, and among the collection, they featured the infamous Harrow image. The segment's host, journalist Ellen Reeves, introduced it casually, unaware that the picture had any real history. The camera panned over the photo, the Harrow family standing before their barn, their eyes dull and hollow. Ellen smiled, commenting that it was a perfect example of early rural portraiture and ghostly imagination. But as the studio lights dimmed for effect, one of the technicians noticed something strange on the monitor feed. The image, projected behind Ellen, seemed to shimmer, not in the playful way of film grain, but as if the shadows in the barn were deepening. The technician adjusted the focus, thinking it was a glare. Yet every adjustment made it worse. The doorway behind the family was now black, a void swallowing detail, and within it, the faint outline of a boy was visible. The director ordered a cut to commercial, but the signal froze. For nearly 15 seconds, the broadcast locked onto the photograph, the black doorway pulsing softly like a heartbeat. When the feed returned, Ellen Reeves appeared shaken. The next morning, calls flooded the station. Viewers from as far as Oklahoma reported seeing the boy move, not flicker, but shift, stepping forward just slightly before the screen went dark. Station engineers claimed it was a broadcasting glitch, but the footage from that night couldn't be recovered. Every reel labeled Segment 3, Harrow photo, was blank. Yet on the audio track, technicians heard something faint, a child's breathing, then laughter just before the cut. Within a week, Ellen resigned. She reportedly suffered vivid nightmares of barns burning, and once confided to a friend that she would wake up with dirt under her fingernails and straw tangled in her hair. The station quietly pulled the episode from reruns, but the damage was done. Copies of the broadcast circulated on home-recorded VHS tapes. In one surviving recording, when the photo first appears, the lights in the studio flicker, and for a brief, impossible frame, the Harrow family isn't looking at the camera anymore. They're looking out of it. By the early 2000s, the legend of the Harrow photograph had faded into the cluttered corners of the internet, whispered about in early message boards and shared between ghost hunters who traded stories like old relics. But in 2006, it surfaced again, this time in the form of a digitally remastered VHS discovered by a Kansas City archivist named Tommy Kessler. Tommy ran a YouTube channel dedicated to restoring old local TV broadcasts, pulling forgotten commercials and newsreels out of oblivion. When he stumbled upon the unlabeled tape at a thrift shop, all he noticed was a faint marker label that read WICH 10/31/76. Curiosity got the better of him. That night, he digitized the footage. Most of it was harmless nostalgia, Halloween ads, local anchors in polyester suits, until the final segment appeared. The Harrow family, 1889. Tommy paused. The image filled his monitor, the same weathered family photo that had haunted rural Kansas for generations. He didn't know what it was, only that something about the stillness in it felt wrong. The figures looked too real, the grain of the photo breathing faintly, like heat rising off pavement. He uploaded the clip under the title Cursed Photograph from 1976 broadcast. Within hours, it exploded. Thousands of comments poured in. Some viewers swore the sixth figure, the boy in the barn, blinked. Others said his face appeared closer every time they paused the video. One user claimed the reflection in the boy's eyes showed movement behind the camera, a shadow that didn't belong to anyone visible in the photo. Tommy laughed it off at first, chalking it up to pixelation. But the laughter didn't last long. 2 days later, Tommy's subscribers noticed something unsettling. In his next upload, a harmless 1980s newsreel, a frame of the Harrow photo flashed for a single second. He hadn't added it. He checked the raw footage. Nothing. The image appeared after the render. Then, during a live stream, as Tommy talked about the strange glitch, his webcam froze. His face vanished into static, replaced by that same sepia photograph. Behind the frozen Harrow family, the barn door was now slightly open. Viewers panicked in the chat, flooding the stream with messages. When the camera finally unfroze, Tommy was gone. The room behind him, empty, chairs swaying, as though he had stepped out mid-sentence. Police found his apartment locked from the inside, computer still running, the monitor displaying the Harrow photo full screen. The cursor blinked in a search bar, spelling out the words, "He's still in the barn." After his disappearance, the video was taken down, but not before copies spread across the internet. Users who re-uploaded it began reporting strange occurrences, corrupted drives, unexplained knocks, voices whispering, "Look behind." One Reddit post claimed that the sixth figure had moved entirely out of the barn, now standing among the family. But no one could agree where he was looking. By 2010, the mystery of the Harrow photograph had drawn the attention of every kind of investigator, from paranormal researchers to local historians and amateur sleuths. Theories range from a cursed lens to early spirit photography, but no one could trace the original negative. Every version circulating online was a copy of a copy, grainier and darker with each generation. That changed when Dr. Elise Warren, an archivist from the University of Kansas, discovered an uncatalogued box while restoring county archives from the 1880s. Inside, wrapped in yellowed cloth and labeled simply Harrow 1889, she found a cracked glass plate, the kind used for early wet collodion photography. When she held it up to the light, her heart nearly stopped. The image was unmistakable. The Harrow family standing in front of their barn, faces fixed in that same eerie calm. But unlike every version that came later, the glass negative showed more. A faint outline of someone, or something, deeper in the shadows behind the barn door. Elise enhanced the image under her microscope, and what emerged didn't make sense. It wasn't a figure exactly, more like a distorted blur, as if someone had moved during exposure. But early photographic methods required subjects to remain still for several minutes. No one could have moved fast enough to create a blur that clear. Elise documented her findings and reached out to a local historical society, hoping to piece together the Harrow family's history. What she uncovered was darker than she expected. The Harrows had lived on a small farmstead outside Cherryvale, Kansas. Records showed 5 family members, Thomas, Ruth, and their 3 children, Mary, Samuel, and infant Clara. No 6th person was listed anywhere. But in county newspapers from late 1889, Elise found something chilling, a headline. Local farm tragedy, boy missing after barn fire. The article described a fire that broke out in the Harrows' barn just weeks after their portrait was taken. The eldest son, Samuel, had reportedly gone missing that night. His body was never found. The parents claimed they'd seen him run toward the barn to save their livestock, but witnesses said no animals were kept inside that evening. Rumors spread that Thomas Harrow had been drinking, that a fight had broken out, and that the fire was no accident. No charges were filed, but within months, the family vanished from all public record. Their property was sold at auction, and the new owners abandoned it within a year, citing whispers from the barn. Dr. Warren continued to study the plate, growing increasingly unsettled. Each time she viewed the negative underlight, she swore the blur seemed closer to the doorway, more defined. One night, after hours alone in the lab, she heard a sharp crack. The glass had split down the middle, though no temperature change or pressure could explain it. She documented the damage in her notes, but the next morning, when she returned, the plate was gone. In its place lay a freshly printed photo on modern paper. The Harrow family again. Only this time the barn door was wide open. The university sealed the lab and launched an internal investigation, but nothing turned up. Elise took a leave of absence shortly after and never returned. Her colleagues later found her research notebook left behind on her desk. The last entry was a single, hastily written sentence. He was never missing. He was waiting. Years later, the Harrow photograph resurfaced online. A Reddit thread titled "The Hidden Son, Real or Hoax" went viral, reigniting interest in the forgotten Kansas mystery. Users compared versions of the photo from archives, private collections, and Dr. Warren's scan notes. Subtle differences emerged. In some, the barn door appeared cracked open. In others, it was tightly shut. But one version, uploaded anonymously, sent chills through anyone who saw it. The faint blur behind the barn had taken shape. A boy, maybe 10 or 11 years old, stood half in shadow, eyes too dark to make out, his mouth slightly open as though whispering something. Experts dismissed it as digital manipulation, yet no one could locate the original uploader. The account disappeared within hours. In Cherryvale, the property where the Harrows once lived had long since returned to nature. Locals avoided it, especially after reports of strange noises, low humming, like wind through metal, though there were no structures left standing. A YouTube explorer group visited the site in 2018, armed with drones and night vision cameras. Their footage began normally: overgrown fields, collapsed beams, and the outline of what might have been the barn's foundation. But when they reviewed the drone footage later, one frame made them freeze. Standing near the barn's remains was a small figure in old-fashioned clothing. The next frame, Nothing. The group posted the video, and it racked up millions of views before being deleted under mysterious circumstances. Rumors spread that the land itself was cursed, that whatever lingered there had been waiting to be noticed again. Locals said they'd seen the boy along the dirt road at dusk, motionless, as if posing for a photograph that no one was taking. His eyes, they said, looked too aware. By 2023, the Harrow photograph had entered internet legend. Forums debated whether it was proof of early spirit photography or a psychological phenomenon tied to grief and guilt. Some argued the sixth figure symbolized the sins of the family, that the missing son represented something darker they tried to hide. Others believed the photo had been altered by the boy himself, his spirit, trapped between exposure and eternity, still trying to be seen. The final twist came from a Kansas historian who uncovered a ledger from the Harrow family's church. Scrawled inside the back cover was a single entry, undated. He never left the barn. The handwriting matched Thomas Harrow's known signature. Theories erupted. Had Thomas buried his son within the structure? Had the fire been meant to erase evidence? No one could say for sure. But what remains certain is this. Every surviving copy of the Harrow photograph, no matter how it's scanned, printed, or displayed, shares one eerie feature. If you stare long enough at the shadows behind the barn, the boy moves. The legend of the forgotten son endures, not just as a ghost story, but as a reminder of how grief and secrets can warp memory itself. Some claim the photo was a hoax, others that it's cursed. Yet, late at night, when the wind rattles old barns across Kansas, locals still whisper that the Harrow's missing child is out there, forever frozen in a photograph that refuses to die.